Here's the connection I mentioned at the beginning. So Obadiah ends with essentially a promise, verses 19 through 21. It lists territories that will be repossessed in the restoration, including the land of Esau. And then verse 21, Savior shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Okay, now look at Amos 9. The prophet Amos makes a very similar promise. In that day I will raise up the fallen booth of David and repair its breaches, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name. So Amos seems to be saying that in the eschatological restoration, Edom, the betrayer, will be brought back under the renewed Davidic kingdom. Now, that all being said, let's jump to Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. The question on the table at this place is whether Gentile converts, so non-Jews, need to be circumcised. Essentially, the question is whether or not they have to follow the full Torah to belong to their community. This is by no means a minor question by any measure. This is potentially the argument that splits the whole movement. So at this rate, Peter has spoken, Paul and Barnabas have spoken, and then now James, the brother of Jesus, the most respected voice in Jerusalem, stands up and gives the deciding speech. And then James actually quotes Amos 9. Acts chapter 15 verses 16 and 17 says this, After this I will return and rebuild the tent of David that has fallen, that the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. So it's interesting that it says the remnant of mankind and not the remnant of Edom. But the book of Amos says Edom. James says humankind and humanity. Why? Well, because James is reading Amos from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint. And in that translation, the word is humanity and not Edom, which at first sounds like James is just quoting a slightly different version of the text, maybe working from a translation error or something like that. But here's what I find interesting. In Hebrew, the words for Edom and the word for humanity, for Adam, for mankind, are almost identical. They have the same letters, they have the same sounds, and are practically indistinguishable, and are really only distinguished by one vowel marking that wasn't even written in the most ancient manuscripts. So the two words, in essence, look nearly identical. So you have two different possibilities here. Either the translators made a mistake and James happened to quote the mistake, or the translator saw the similarities between the two words and made an interpretive decision. And then James saw it too. I lean toward the second, because what James is actually doing is, or in that quote, is making a theological claim in nature. The Amos text is about Israel possessing Edom in the restoration. James reads it as the restored Davidic community bringing in humanity. The nations, including the Gentiles who were outside of the covenant, as it were, or as Edom ever was, really. And the pattern that runs through Obadiah now is completely reversed. Edom was the one, if you remember, like I said earlier, stood at the crossroads and then turned the survivors of Israel away. But now the church stands at the crossroads and then gathers everyone in. The restoration of David's tent, or the booth from before, isn't the rebuilding of the physical structure, it's this. The scattered and the excluded people are being brought in rather than being turned away, just like Edom did to them. James uses that argument in that moment, and then the council decides to welcome Gentile believers without requiring them to be circumcised. That decision shapes the entire trajectory of the church from that point forward. All of this is threading back through Amos, through that tradition in Obadiah that's a part of, back through 21 verses that most people skip on their way to Jonah. And I'll be honest, the first time I read Obadiah, I thought, wow, I don't get it. However, what Obadiah is doing in those 21 verses is establishing this pattern. The betrayal that happens at the crossroads, the kinsman brother who turns away the survivors, and the nation whose pride points them back literally to the original rebellion in Genesis 3. That pattern gets picked up by Amos, and Amos gets carried into the most consequential room in the early church, and James reads the words about Edom being brought back under the restored tent of David and says, this is literally what's happening right now. The nations are coming back in, don't turn them away at the crossroads. What Edom did in 586 BC, standing at the crossing points to catch the refugees and to send them back into exile, is the exact thing that James argues that the church must not do. The restoration of David's tent is the reversal of that moment. And then the crossroads becomes the place where you gather people in rather than handing them back. Paul actually put his version of this in Romans 11. A partial hardening on Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and then all of Israel will be saved. So the whole arc, from the family betrayal back in Genesis, to Babylon attacking Israel and putting them into exile, to the scattering tribes, to the Jerusalem Council, to the ends of the earth, is the story of God bringing the people back. And Obadiah, 1 chapter, 21 verses, that a prophet that most people skip, is part of that argument. And that's why I wanted to make this video. Not just that the small books connect to the big ones per se, though they do, but the places that in the biblical story where people get betrayed are the same places where the writers plant their deepest promises about what restoration actually seems to look like. Edom stood at the crossroads. We're called not to. And the story of that, of course, is not over yet. So that is my attempt at explaining the book of Obadiah. There's also different opinions about this practically being in a future apocalypse type thing, but at least that's my attempt. So whether or not you agree with that, let me know.